From the studio that has won no awards whatsoever comes the podcast that should have already been canceled. Welcome to another episode of Have You Read This? A podcast for bookworms, lovers of sarcasm, and those dangerously close to overdosing on caffeine. Load up on ibuprofen, because here comes 15 minutes of your life you'll never be able to get back.
For those that don't know, and judging by the number of subscribers that I have, most of you have no clue, I've been working on creating and posting videos to my YouTube channel. Now, all of these podcast episodes can be listened there, of course, but I thought, what else could I do with this? Like a couple years ago, I think I had created some cabin reading ambiance type video and uploaded it to my personal YouTube, and people cared less, I should say. People don't care now. They cared even less then. But for some reason, this one got 5 times the traffic when I uploaded it to a new channel. Go figure. Maybe people just hate me. That's okay. But anyway, I've been creating some videos basically to play in the background while you read, or just collapse from the stress of being alive. And whenever I want to sit down and read, I absolutely cannot have it quiet. The silence, you ever heard that saying, the silence is too loud? Like, that is absolutely it for me. It just like rings in my head. But I also don't want having a TV show on or a movie, something that'll distract me, something that I've got to focus on. I know that there's countless channels out there that do stuff like this, but thought it might be fun, another creative outlet. So look up Have You Read This podcast on YouTube. All I need you to do is go like every video and just play it in the background and repeat about 1 million times. That would really help me. So I guess I'm starting these episodes with what I just read, what I'm reading now, and what's on the horizon. Last book that I finished was titled High, Stories of Survival from Everest and K2 by Clint Willis. The first book that I feel made me a reader was Into Thin Air by John Krakauer, and episode 27 was also devoted solely to him. So it should probably be pretty obvious that I like pretty much anything about Everest. And if that's hard to understand for you, then I imagine you think Jake Paul boxing matches aren't rigged. But I'm currently reading Flesh and Blood by Andrew Shanahan, which is the sequel to Before and After. I had no idea that it had a sequel. I think so far it's a fantastic series, and it's so unique. It's really hard to find end of the world scenarios, especially anything involving zombies that feel fresh and different, but this is definitely one. And I swear, if Andrew screws this book up, I just don't know how I'm going to live with myself. Following Flesh and Blood, and I'm actually going to head to the library to pick this one up, is a copy of Rings of Saturn. I was debating and even going to mention this, but this is a book that my therapist recommended. One of the things that I really enjoy doing lately is if you catch anybody in a bookstore or anybody online that shares their home library, it's like filled floor to ceiling with books. I love asking them, like, what is the one single book that you would say is your favorite? You can't recommend 5. You can't sit there and stutter and say, well, I don't know how to pick. And there's been the last couple times that I've asked people this, I've gone out and gotten that book and read it without checking anything else about it. And it's been really fun to try and do that. So Rings of Saturn is next up on the list for me. So I've never really done a roundup type episode. Most of the episodes have been dedicated to really an author or a single book or a series. There's been a couple books that I've read lately that I kind of want to jabber on about, and I think you should read, or I would like for you to read them, and then, I don't know, send me hate mail, whatever. The first book is Good Looking Ugly. Now, I got to admit, this book was sent to me by the author, Rob Smith, and I feel like I need to tell you that even though he sent me a copy, there was absolutely no promise or expectation of me doing anything in the podcast about it. I think this is his debut novel, and the guy's just trying to get the word out about his book, which totally makes sense to me. And the main reason I wanted to talk about it is because I think this book for me is proof of why reading outside of your typical genre or likes or whatever is so important. Good Looking Ugly primarily centers around Daniel Brown, and poor Daniel is, you guessed it, this guy is ugly. And I think that's putting it mildly, because it's brought up enough in the book to make me feel like this guy, like calling him ugly is probably is a compliment. Like, it's talked a lot. And so the guy's probably pretty hideous, but he also has inside of him a rage that he has a hard time controlling. And in the past, he hasn't controlled it, and it's gotten him in trouble with the police. And as a result, he has required therapy and probation to keep him out of prison. Daniel connects with his cousin Jayla, who wants to rob a cockfighting event that is run by her ex-boyfriend. I also think it's important to note that this episode marks the very first time the word cockfighting has ever been used. So thank you, Rob, for that. And my 14-year-old brain sometimes really just can't handle words like that. So anyway, please hold your applause until the end. Jayla has the inside scoop on how to get this job done, but she needs Daniel, and he's probably one of the very few people she can trust to help. He's probably one of the only few people that she knows that's capable of doing what she needs done. And if I'd read the synopsis on the back of this book, I think I'd have to say that I probably would have put it back up on the shelf. I'm not saying the story sounds lame. I'm just saying that typically I don't seek out and read books like this, which involve, I guess, kind of like a heist or a robbery. I'm not really, I'm not a cockfighting expert. Really don't seek out cockfighting. It's just not my thing. Sorry. Had this been done in the middle of a zombie apocalypse, then yeah, I would have scooped it up immediately. This goes back to my point earlier about reading books outside of what you normally like to read, because I would have missed out on a really good book by a new author. I should say new, because this book really was different. For me, I really loved this character of Daniel. And while I was reading, I kept trying to create a visual of this guy in my head. I don't know if any of y'all do this. I just couldn't quite pinpoint it. At times I thought, okay, I know exactly what this guy would look like, how he would walk, how he would move. And then there was other times where I thought, okay, I just can't, it was kind of muddy. So I actually liked that. I thought Daniel was dark, but there was a lot of ways where he was relatable. I think he just wanted to be a regular guy, he just wasn't. There were plenty of times where I wanted the guy to just go berserk and absolutely burn the whole place down. So pairing a character like Daniel up with his cousin and her friend Meg, I thought was a really good touch, because it created enough conflict and differences that made that interesting. And if I was trying to imagine, like, if you took all of these people and you put them in a room of like 100 people, I would say you're probably not going to pick Daniel, Meg, and Jayla out and say, yeah, these are friends, because I just feel like that there was enough differences in them that would separate them. So you just get this unlikely bunch that's going to go pull off this robbery, right? I feel like it would also be safe to say that this one's kind of a slow burn. There were a few spots that I felt like, okay, maybe we could have skipped that. Like, was that just added in? I don't know enough about that kind of thing. Does somebody come back and be like, well, you got 230 pages, it really needed to be 350. Somebody goes in and writes another chapter. I don't know how that works. But I also understand why Smith included much of what he did. I think you need this kind of buildup for all of the activity that takes place. I would also love to go in details here about the ending. I've kind of got this policy here, I guess, as if I'm somebody official, but I usually avoid spoilers. So I'm not going to ruin it for you. I've mentioned this countless times. When you get to the end of any book, I like to guess what's going to happen. And then I just pray that the author doesn't ruin the whole book with an ending worse than a Jake Paul Mike Tyson fight. Thankfully, Rob Smith is better than Netflix and decided not to ruin a good thing. I really loved the ending of this, and I don't think I could find a better way for him to have ended it. This is also one of those books that I think should be a movie. And for those that don't know, I live in Kentucky, so does Rob. I appreciated all of the local references, and I think that I might have gravitated more towards that than someone who lives elsewhere, obviously, because I just thought it was a nice touch. But the mood and the vibe of a movie about this book, I think would be great if it was done like, and I'm thinking No Country for Old Men or maybe even Unforgiven. Maybe Rob is listening to this and thinking to himself, did this guy actually read a book at all? It's not at all what I was trying to imagine when creating this. But I think that's one of the most beautiful aspects of reading is presenting readers with your story and vision, but leaving enough room for them to also form their own visuals. So where did the title come from? Obviously, Daniel's ugly. Okay, we get that. But according to Smith, it was inspired by two branches of the same tree, and this was pulled from the acknowledgments. This quote is from a Boris Karloff character in a 1935 film called The Raven. This killer was driven to a life of violence by his unseemly appearance. Ever since I was born, everybody looks at me and says, "You're ugly." Makes me feel mean. I twisted that together with the French term jolie lady. And for those listening, you're like, you didn't pronounce that right. Yeah, you probably didn't. But that translates to pretty ugly or good looking ugly. A belief that even someone with a distinctive, unattractive appearance by society's norms can still be beautiful, can still find peace. So for the two of you out there listening, I want you to go pick this book up. I want you to read it. Then I want you to tell me, what do you think? Does Daniel find peace at the end? Next on the list, Rest Stop. I have not read anything by Nat Cassidy before this one, even though Nestlings has been on my TBR for probably years now, or I don't even know when he wrote it. Maybe he wrote that a year ago. It's been on there freaking forever. This one's a pretty short read, and I think it tops out somewhere like, I don't know, 170 pages. So you could easily tackle this in one day. Or if you read like Netflix streams live events, this would take you 3 months. The general plot here is pretty simple. There is a young musician and he's hitting the road. He stops at a gas station in the middle of the night. He ends up getting locked in the bathroom by some unknown person or assailant. And you don't really know why or what the purpose of this. I would say maybe torture is probably the right word. Torment. There we go. You don't really know why that's happening. The synopsis tells us that he is caught between the horrors on the other side of the door and the horrors rapidly skittering down the walls inside, which probably sounds a lot like being in the White House. But for a short book, this one really has a whole lot going on. It actually surprised me how much character development can be done in a short period of time. And I kind of wanted to touch on that for just a second. Like I've read, and I'm picking on just the splatterpunk genre here, but I've read some shorter books and there's zero character development. It's like, well, this person is a criminal. That's really kind of all you get. And I think that speaks to Nat's creativity, and his ability really shines here to take a short story, I would say short, add in the character development that he does, the way that he does it. Given my old age, I know I repeat things over and over again, which is to prepare you for me saying this book is one wild ride. Something I know I've probably said many times already. I go back and think about this and think like, oh, that book was a wild ride. And if you see me using that phrase over and over again on Goodreads reviews, just watch your mouth. Don't bring it up. But if you're a true fan of horror, I think you'll like this book. And I think you'll agree. It actually is a pretty wild ride. It inches close enough to splatterpunk without crossing that line, and it has so many crazy and unexpected events that take place. And I think that's for me what kept me turning the page. I got to this point where I was in this cycle of, wait a minute, what the hell just happened here? And right after that, it's like, well, I can't stop reading now. I got to know what happens next. Like where did that come from? And in some instances it was, and maybe this is an unfair comparison, I don't know, but in a way there was times where it reminded me of watching Lost, where all of a sudden you're like, holy crap, there's a polar bear. Where did the polar bear come from? And then when you think you're going to get an answer about the polar bear, there's something else introduced, and it just keeps you hooked. I felt like there was a lot of that going on here with this book. And I think I'm similar to other reviewers of this one when they say that probably their biggest issue with this book was the length. Nat has no shortage of imagination and talent. And I think everybody really just wanted more of that into this book. It reminded me so much of when I read Scanlines by Todd Kiesling. That book was so good, and it was actually legitimately terrifying, but it was way too short. Rest Stop, I think, was written well enough, and this actually not think. I know Rest Stop was written well enough to make me want to go read his other works. So props to you, Nat. And finally, in the roundup, and I mentioned this on last episode, I think I talked about like this was the book that I had planned on reading next, but this is Zombie by Joyce Carol Oates. And I know what you're thinking. And then, nope, this is not actually about the 46th president of the United States. This is told from the perspective of a man named Quentin, who is a psychopath and a killer. And I was hesitant to even read this one because of the low average reading on Goodreads. Right now, I think it's about 3.3 stars, which would usually be enough to make me skip a book. But kind of like Baby Teeth, this is just another case where people clearly get too caught up in the actual material. They can't seem to wrap their head around a talented author when they find it. I hope I say this correctly. I hope you understand where I'm coming from. But there was at times where I felt like I was reading Lolita. There were times where I felt like I was reading The Necrophiliac. And there were even times where I felt like I was reading American Psycho. This story is told from Quentin's serial killer perspective, almost like a journal style, and it's in his own words, but it's showing how aware he is of some areas of his life, but also how completely detached and deranged he still is in others. I remember first reading Cormac McCarthy and thinking about how unique the style was. I got the same vibe when I read A Clockwork Orange. In fact, I don't know, for those of you that have read A Clockwork Orange, I don't know if you can relate to this, but I started reading, I got into like the first paragraph and I was like, what is this? And I actually skipped to the end to see if the whole thing was written that way. And sure enough, it was. But this book is similar in that the sentence structure, punctuation, it's so unique and it plays perfectly into the mind that is the main character. I also thought that this one had a really great conclusion. I love how she ended this. And I think it takes some guts to write something like this, which is probably another reason why I loved it so much. And when I was looking up more information about this, I thought this was kind of neat. I found back in 2010, Thomas Caruso directed a movie titled Zombie based on this novel and apparently a Broadway play. The fact that somebody made or even consider making a Broadway play out of this book blows my mind. It was described as, and I'm talking about this 2010 movie, as a mild-mannered Jeffrey Dahmer-esque serial killer who commits his final crime. I looked all over to find this short film because I was so intrigued, but I could never locate a place to watch it. All I found was a minute-long trailer. For now, I guess all we have is the book, and I guess if somebody decides to do another Broadway play about it, that's pretty much all we get, which really, honestly, is plenty because it is a pretty dark story. So for those of you out there who really enjoy dark and disturbing reads, this one's right up your alley, and I think it'll push the limits a little bit. So wrapping all of this up, I know those of you that make it to the end of these things, you're clapping, you're thinking, this is it. I don't have to listen to this guy talk forever today. Good Looking Ugly by Rob Smith, Rest Stop, Nat Cassidy, and Zombie by Joyce Carol Oates. 3 more books to make your TBR even longer and even more absurd than it already is. If you read any of these based on my suggestion alone, I would love it if you would email me or post it up on social media and tag me and say, hey, heard this on the podcast and I checked it out and you're an idiot. I'm never going to listen to your suggestions again. Or thank you for imparting such great wisdom upon me. I have been reading the wrong books all my life, but because of you, I have now seen the light. Either one of those routes I find pretty acceptable. At the end of the day, just love connecting with other readers. I love feedback, either on the podcast or just what to read, suggestions, you name it. Until next time.
I hope the Xanax lasted you through all of that nonsense. Since you are still here, it would give my undies a tingle if you drop a 5-star review. Follow Have You Read This podcast on Instagram, or I will beat you to death with my walker. Now get me out of here and get me my back pills.